Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for coming. Welcome to Policy Exchange. My name is Richard Howard. I'm the head of Energy and Environment at Policy Exchange, and I'd just like to say thank you for all of you for attending the event. I'm delighted to welcome the Right Honourable Matthew Hancock to speak with us today. He'll be giving a keynote speech setting out his view of energy policy going forward, which is it's a great time to be having this sort of debate. Energy remains a hugely topical issue in the political debate, in media as well, not only because of the election, but also because of everything else that's going on a global, European and domestic level as well. So we're delighted to have Matt Hancock here today. He's a very sort of distinguished guest. He's had an amazing political career, elected as a... Well, I'll read you through the list of things. Is having elected as MP for West Suffolk in 2010, appointed Minister for Skills in 2012 and promoted in 2013 and again in 2014 to take his cross-departmental role as Minister for State for both Business and Enterprise and for Energy and Minister for Portsmouth. And his portfolio is staggeringly wide. He has an amazing brief covering electricity market reform, security of supply, carbon capture and storage, nuclear, renewable energy, oil and gas, shale, regulation, energy resilience, the list goes on, business, green investment bank, deregulation, and all sorts of other business interests, including Royal Mail and various other things. So he has an enormous brief, so it's great that he's come here to speak to us today. He's also spoken with Policy Exchange before a couple of times, so it's great to welcome Matt back. So I'll hand over to you. We'll have some questions and answer at the end. I'll hand over to Matthew.
Thank you very much indeed, and it's a great pleasure to be here and back at Policy Exchange, the host of some of my favourite speeches by many people over the years, and you play a vital role in stimulating the debate. So I'm very grateful for this opportunity that you've given me. And today I want to lay out the vision for a prosperous future in which we tackle the risks posed by climate change. And I also want to set out and argue that it is Conservatives who are best placed to get us there. The risk of the potential for catastrophic climate change is a huge intergenerational problem. That has to be our starting point. Tackling it requires us to recognise that we have obligations not just to the current generation, but to generations yet unborn. And this is something that my party has always believed, that we are not freeholders of this earth, but trustees, and that our task in government is to leave the world a better place for those who come after. It's there in the history of our party, from Disraeli's efforts to tackle urban squalor in the 1870s through to the Clean Air Act of the Eden government in the 1950s. And in the 1980s, it was Margaret Thatcher, of course, who was the first global leader to call for concerted action on carbon emissions, and she threw her full weight behind the global drive to phase out CFCs. So this agenda is not new to us, and the long-term thinking we need to deliver on it is second nature. And my argument today falls into three parts. First, that it's a grave mistake to cordon off the question of carbon reduction from the broader economic debate about how we become a more prosperous world. And I suppose my joint ministerial position, both in BIS and in DEC, underlines this link between the broader economic debate and how we tackle carbon emissions. Second, that it's a worse mistake to set those two goals at odds. We mustn't think of sustainability opposing prosperity, but rather that to have successful carbon reduction, it must have cost effectiveness at its heart. And third, that markets are the best method we have for driving down costs and making innovation commercially and economically viable. So let me take each of these in turn. First, on the need for prosperity. Renewable energy requires significant upfront investment. Prosperous economies like Britain have led the way on this agenda for the simple reason that we can afford to. It's a fallacy to think that you can decouple carbon reduction from the pursuit of economic growth. Just last month, you will have seen that Citi, the bank, announced a 100 billion new fund to invest in carbon reduction projects. International finance pays for the kit we need to cut emissions. And globally, carbon emissions are falling fastest in the world's largest major economy, while the biggest investor in renewable energy is the world's second largest. Other fast-growing BRIC nations like Brazil and India are also making huge investments in wind and in solar, and the current leadership of these countries grew up in a world where illiteracy was common, where infant mortality was high, and where, especially in China and India, if a crop failed, then whole villages would starve. And it is inconceivable that they would be now signing climate deals and pouring hundreds of billions into renewable energy if their world had not been transformed by 20 years of double-digit growth. By contrast, the ecological catastrophe of the old Soviet Union occurred because the absence of property rights meant no one had any incentive to adopt a long-term view on the use of natural resources. And the result was radioactive lakes in the Urals, desertification of Central Asia, and air pollution 10 times the official limit in some cities. So those in the green movement who seek to conscript environmental protection into a broader anti-capitalist narrative could not be more wrong. A strong and healthy economy is essential for tackling climate change, or you could say that our long-term economic plan is vital to go green. We've seen in Europe that it becomes much harder to win the argument for expensive environmental policies during a recession. That's why we must continue to deal with the deficit, to proof our economy against the risk of a future financial crisis, and we must deliver on our ambition to make the UK the best place in the world to start and grow a business, not least because this problem requires an entrepreneurial mindset and innovation to solve it. So that's the first point that we need to bear in mind if we want to tackle this problem. The second is very closely related to the first. Realistic action requires us to cut carbon and cut costs at the same time. Carbon reduction requires a global framework, and we will not achieve it in Paris later this year unless we can show the developing world that it is possible to green your economy while reducing, not increasing costs. Visit the slums of Mumbai, the favelas of Rio, the shanty towns of Lagos, and tell the people who live there that you want to take away their portable gas stoves and charge them more for their electricity, those that are lucky enough to have it in the first place. I imagine they would tell you where to shove your contract for difference. Yet this is exactly what some expect governments in lower and middle income countries to do. We in the industrialised West, who have benefited enormously from fossil fuels over the last 2 centuries, we have a duty to make low carbon energy cost effective for others. And this means abandoning a dogmatic preference for certain renewable technologies where other low-carbon alternatives, including nuclear, make more economic sense. And once you strip away the wildly exaggerated safety concerns and the disingenuous price comparisons with fossil fuels, the hostility to nuclear that some have boils down to a sense that it is less natural and therefore less legitimate than wind or solar or wave, which is odd, considering that the large ball in the sky, which we can occasionally see from here, is itself a large ball of nuclear energy, and it's what makes all life on Earth possible. No responsible supporter of action to tackle greenhouse gas emissions can oppose nuclear power out of principle. And I believe we are reaching an exciting moment when renewable energy becomes cost competitive. In some sunny countries where financing costs are low, solar is already at a par with gas. But here in Britain, the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow, so we need to be creative. We need more innovation to make renewable energy cheaper and cheaper to store. And we need creative policy solutions too, like the interconnector to Norway, which we're working on with the Norwegians, which will allow us, when it's built, to import low-carbon electricity produced using 98% hydropower from their extraordinary geography. But until renewables are both competitive and easily stored, shale gas, within a robust regulatory framework, will remain part of the solution. And this need to innovate means we must also focus public support at innovation, which pound for pound has far greater cost-cutting potential than any subsidy for existing technology. Now, as a government, we've already identified serious cost-cutting potential in 11 technology families, including nuclear and bioenergy, offshore wind and marine. For 3 technologies alone, heat, building energy efficiency and carbon capture and storage, these savings are estimated to amount to 80 billion by 2050. One example in this area is the support we're providing to NIAC, a new Cambridge University spin-out, which has become the leader in organic photovoltaics, delivering through Innovate UK, in partnership with both DEC and the EPSRC. Our Energy Catalyst programme is supporting NIAC to assess the technical and commercial feasibility of a newly developed solar cell technology that has the potential to reduce the cost of solar cells 30% to 30% of today's commercially available organic solar devices. I set out this example. It's one of 40 Energy Catalyst projects announced this week, sharing 25 million of grant to support commercial solutions to the need for low-cost, low-carbon energy. And of course, the development of technology and technological advance is inherently unpredictable. We can't know in advance which technologies will achieve the greatest carbon reduction at the lowest cost. Look at the dramatic fall in the cost of solar PV outside of the EU, which is why it's best to create a level playing field to reward the most cost-effective solution. And that brings me on to my third point, that market mechanisms are the best way to discover more cost-effective forms of low-carbon power. Now, we've introduced a competition for the subsidy that we have, and with the aim of moving towards a technology-neutral auction for all low-carbon power generation. Unlike fixed subsidies, which increase in proportion the more inefficient a technology is, competitive auctions incentivize manufacturers to drive down costs, and the electricity market reforms have created a market for low-carbon electricity, and then alongside the levy control framework, which caps the costs for customers. Tomorrow morning, we will publish the results of the first CFD auction, and we will be able to assess then the impact of this competition for subsidy on the cost effectiveness of moving to low carbon energy. And over time, as technologies mature, we expect lower cost technologies to gain a larger market share, and eventually subsidies will be phased out altogether. So I think that this is an exciting time. And along with making different technologies compete for subsidies, we can also drive down costs by supporting a market for more efficient demand management with the Smart Meters programme, replacing 53 million smart meters with smart gas and electricity meters by 2020, and allowing consumers to pay less for electricity generated when it is cheaper. And as people grow to better understand and manage their energy use, they'll be able to cut both bills and carbon emissions, and I do it myself. And contrary to the naysayers, this market approach that we take also encourages investment. Between 2010 and 2013, we secured 45 billion of investment in energy and electricity infrastructure. And as a result, renewable electricity capacity in the UK has more than doubled since 2010. And in the decade that follows, new nuclear, first at Hinkley Point and then elsewhere, will develop. And after a decade of neglect, before 2010, a further 100 billion is likely to be needed in our electricity sector. But be in no doubt that we're committed to helping investors to deliver this, and the reformed electricity market system makes it possible. So, tackling carbon emissions at the lowest possible cost is a huge challenge. We need to be both ambitious about the power of human ingenuity to solve the problem, but also pragmatic about the way that we build an international consensus and the way that we use markets to deliver it. That is a very conservative combination of optimism and realism, and it will allow us to build a cleaner, greener, and brighter future for Britain. Thank you very much.
I'll just kick off with a few questions, and then I'm sure there'll be a lot of interest from the floor to ask you a few questions as well. I thought that was really interesting, the focus on cost competitiveness, and particularly driving down the cost of renewables. Policy Exchange has written previously on that before. I can see Guy Newey right at the back, who did a report called Going, Gone, which was very much had those principles in mind. I suppose my question is whether you think the CFD as currently structured is doing enough to push through that competition. So, or are we hampering it? Is it a very good idea that we've slightly hamstrung by the way in which it's been implemented? I'm thinking of things like the fact that we can still issue CFDs outside the competition, for example, and the way that the funding available is split up into different pots. Are you comfortable with the way that that's being rolled out, or is there anything that you would like to change going forward?
Well, I have to be very careful in what I give as an answer, because I know the results of the auction tomorrow morning and you don't. And so, entirely privately and between us, because since nobody's listening, I won't say anything. But in principle, of course, the purpose of the CFD was and is to bring a competitive pressure to bear to make sure that subsidies go as far as they possibly can, so that instead of setting subsidy administratively by estimating it as with all possible best efforts and best analysis is always going to be imperfect. Instead of that, there is a market to see at what price you can best use subsidy. We'll see tomorrow morning the results. The question of whether the number of pots and the allocation of some CFDs outside of the auctions is perfect is a very reasonable one. Of course, you've got to be pragmatic, because different technologies need different types of contract. But, as I said in the speech, the goal of a technology-neutral auction is a reasonable one that we must pursue, but we need to make sure that we don't put what is a clear theoretically attractive proposition ahead of pragmatically making sure the thing works.
My second question, you mentioned interconnection, which I also find very interesting. We've written on that as well before. So one of the things, in fact we had a good debate about that here a few weeks ago, one of the things in the current design and how this is being rolled out, it seems that interconnectors, although we all think they're a great idea and there's a lot of interest coming through from developers, the actual amount of subsidy, or support rather, they've received through the capacity mechanism is relatively modest and limited to 1 year only in the current way of looking at this. I wonder, so I think some things like interconnection and demand-side response could be really disruptive and change the way that we think about capacity and security. But I wonder whether we're doing enough to encourage those options.
Well, the interconnectors are developing on a commercial basis. They pay for themselves, and so they're not in a CFD at all. Of course, they can enter into the capacity market, and that's a perfectly reasonable proposition. Whether you want to put them into a slightly different part of that market, I think the first auction showed that was working pretty well as well for the time being. But in the long term, we do need much more interconnection. And as I pointed out, some of the attraction of interconnection is also that you buy in low-carbon electricity. The interconnector to Norway I mentioned, where Norway has 98% hydro, France, of course, has a very high proportion of low-carbon nuclear energy. And so electricity that comes over an interconnector from France is ultimately pretty low-carbon electricity, although at the margin, their nuclear plant is not producing the marginal power, so it's less clear-cut on that side. But interconnectors are a very, very important part of strengthening our energy security.
And just one final question before we open it up to the floor. You said quite a bit about innovation in your speech, about supporting the solar project and other things. There's an ongoing debate, I think, within government and the advisors to government about whether it's best to support innovation or innovative low-carbon technologies through research and development funding or through deployment, as in subsidies, CFDs, renewables, automation, and so on. And I just wondered what your take is on that, whether we have the balance right at the moment, or whether perhaps we should spend our money, push it more towards R&D, and would we get a bang for our buck?
Well, clearly the best answer is a balance between the two. The best innovation is not only government funded, but also in collaboration, and usually with international collaboration as well. I said in the speech that pound for pound, money put into innovation has more long-term potential. Because if we change the technology we can use, then we're changing not only today's carbon emissions, but also the future carbon emissions. So I'm very excited about the potential of innovation to solve these problems. And this is a long-term intergenerational challenge, and so innovating over that period is very important. This is a genuinely exciting moment because there is a potential for us all to be to see solar become cost competitive, even in Britain, within the next few years or decade or so. The electric car developments are really exciting and really motoring, if you excuse the pun. The developments in storage are a little bit further behind, but still are moving. And I think that when these things become cost competitive without subsidy, suddenly there'll be a remarkable change. And that will be as big as the change in telecoms and phones when mobile suddenly became commercially viable. And everybody changed the way that they live their life, and it solved a lot of people's problems. And that was because the technology reached a key point at which it can work without the support and backing of taxpayers or bill payers' money.
Okay, well, I've got way more questions, but I'll hold them back. I'm sure there are lots of other questions from the floor, so we've got some roving mics somewhere. If I can just chuck your hand if you have any questions. There's one down here at the front. Just say your name who you represent.
Gavin Miller, Institution of Civil Engineers. You mentioned smart meters in passing and the desire to allow people to buy electricity when it's cheaper.
Yeah.
If that's the case, then why is the government pursuing the current system of smart meters, which have been much criticised by bodies such as the Public House Committee, rather than scrapping that and going for truly smart meters, dynamic meters, rather than the current system, which is essentially passive?
I don't accept the critique. The smart meters program will allow the use not only of an in-home display, but also connectivity to a whole series of dynamic systems that are both known and as yet undesigned and unknown. By making sure, essentially, a smart meter changes the consumption of energy by a normal person from essentially a piece of hardware into a piece of software. And as soon as you make metering based on software, there are a whole load of applications that can be designed. The current program allows for that to happen. Yes, it also has an in-home display, and the evidence from where they've been introduced, including in Australia, is very powerful in terms of the positive impact they have on people managing down their energy use. But the in-home display itself, because it means that when you're in the home with somebody who doesn't actually care much about energy, doesn't think about it all the time, as I and many people in this room do, it is physically there for them to be able to use and manage. But the smart meter program will also absolutely then hook up with much more sophisticated devices, which are as yet, both things like Nest, which I use personally, and other devices that are and ways of managing the system which we haven't yet thought about.
That's one supplementary question to that. Through the retail market review, are we not limiting smart? Because time of use tariffs are the way you get the most from this technology. But at the moment, Ofgem has talked about them, but at the moment, my understanding is it would not be possible to put in place a time of use tariff, or you'd have to apply for a derogation if you wanted to do that.
Well, so it is possible. This is, you've got to make sure that you get the physical change through putting smart meters in people's homes alongside the changes in the tariffs. And that's a perfectly reasonable, the time scale over which it will take to roll this out means that that's a reasonable, we've got enough time to sort that out. But there's definitely, it's very clear that the potential from time of use tariffs is very great.
Any other questions?
Environment is from the Sunday Times. So you and the Liberals have worked very closely in the coalition and done, in a sense, quite a good job in achieving consensus. But we're coming up to an election now, and we need things to choose between you. So now you're coming up to an election. What do you offer that Ed Davey's party doesn't offer? What's the difference in vision? Why should we vote for you and not for them?
Well, where to start? So what we offer is competence and a very clear direction. We offer as I said, a vision, but a pragmatic route to getting there. As it happens, I work very closely with Ed Davey. I think that we are deeply evidence-led. To pay tribute to Ed Davey, he's also at the reasonable end of his own party. He is a very, very strong supporter of nuclear power, and he has worked tirelessly to get Hinckley to the point that it is. And that is an unusual position for a Liberal Democrat to take. Probably the most damaging thing I can say about Ed Davey is be really nice to him, about him. But it has been a coalition effort. We have a very clear conservative view of the need to tackle climate change in a way that keeps costs as low as possible. Of course, in any government, there are areas where we disagreed, and we were very keen, for instance, to make sure that that charges that were put onto bills were removed as much as possible, which was done over the last year, and bills are 50 quid lower as a result. But I would say that the department is characterised more by a sense of clear direction than lots of division. But I take that as a compliment. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and outline a whole load of areas where he and I have disagreed.
Ways of choosing between you each actually have a choice in terms of who you vote for.
Well, there's a whole load of choice out there. There's a whole load of choice. You could go for the Labour Party, which has an absolutely bonkers proposal, which was to freeze energy prices much higher than they are now, and which they appear now to. They now call it a cap, not a freeze, despite the fact that I remember when they launched it next to a great big ice block. You could go for UKIP, who I wouldn't, but you could go for UKIP, whose policy on this is not doesn't take into account the risks of climate change at all. You could go for the Green Party, but I think that socialism is a way to a dirtier country and a dirtier system. The fact that the Liberal Democrats and we have been able to run a fairly, a relatively tight ship on energy, I think demonstrates that whilst there's differences, we have a very clear vision. But the central point of this is that there is one party after the next election who have a clear plan. We know what we want to do. We know where we're going. And all of the other parties represent chaos. The problem is if you vote Lib Dem, you're more likely to get Ed Miliband as your Prime Minister, and then energy policy would be in a terrible state.
Let's move on. A question.
Hello, Dustin Benton from Green Alliance. I wonder if you could comment on the relationship between industrial policy and energy policy,
Yeah.
given your two hats.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking particularly about both offshore wind and carbon capture and storage.
Yeah.
So with offshore wind, we've got possibilities of large deployment, which might bring industrial benefits, but that comes at a cost. With carbon capture and storage, it's extraordinarily important for industry, but it's being funded entirely by the power sector.
I'd add a third area where this is really important, which is carbon leakage. So the energy-intensive industries package in the budget last year was put in place because because charges added to energy bills for energy-intensive industries were simply meaning that we were at risk of losing activity to other places in the world where the regulations and the constraints were lower, and therefore policies that were aimed at reducing carbon would actually have led to a worse situation, as well as being bad for industry. So there's areas where the whole thing goes as in line. On carbon capture and storage, we're strong supporters of it. We've got a huge amount of government budget behind it, behind the development of a commercial proposition. And I hope that we get to a commercial proposition. It's exciting. There's one commercial scale plant operating in Canada, and there's a couple of others, that are making progress elsewhere around the world. But the two UK projects are progressing well, and as you say, that's very important for industry, and very important for all sorts of industries, the coal mining industry, for instance. Then on what was the offshore wind, we've got, as with everything else, we've got to make sure we get the best possible value for money for the subsidy that's put in by bill payers. But one of the advantages of being the global leader in offshore wind is that we have a growing domestic supply chain, as we saw with the investment in Hull and by Siemens and many other things. So there it's about marrying the advantages of have taken the choice to having an environmental policy that tackles carbon emissions. But I don't think it's best to justify interventions in energy by the number of jobs they create. We've got to make sure that when we make interventions in energy, where there are job advantages, we make the most of them, but that's different from saying that this is justified first and foremost by the jobs that it creates. The policy here needs to be justified on its own terms. There's a few more.
Sarah Tennyson from Tees Valley Limited, with a local enterprise partnership covering Teesside. Just want to pick up on carbon capture and storage.
So do you say Teesside or Deeside?
Teesside.
Teesside.
Yeah. So I just want to pick up on carbon capture and storage a little bit more. Obviously, industrial carbon capture and storage has a fantastic potential not only to significantly cut carbon emissions, but also to generate economic growth for the area. The issue is how to finance it. I'd like to understand a little bit more about what the plans are. First of all, whether it's a technology that you support, but also what the plans are to actually get it off the ground in the next Parliament.
So I support carbon capture and storage so long as it works and is commercially viable, in the same way as I support other technologies. I find this, when I first was made energy minister, I got asked a question by a journalist, what is your favorite technology? And do you know what? I think that's a totally inappropriate question to answer. I don't have a favorite technology. So I support CCS if it works. By the way, if it doesn't work, then I'll stop supporting it. That's not how it, that's, it is sort of obvious. in a sense. So but I support what I do support is the work that we've put government money into, taxpayers' money into, to find out if CCS can work. And so I do understand why people ask the question. I just think that it's best to follow the technology rather than to pick winners amongst the technologies. In the next Parliament, we have a very clear work programme. In the next Parliament, I hope that will come to fruition. I hope that we get to commercial deployment, but we've put plenty of subsidy in to help us get there. In terms of industrial CCS, we have a framework in which we have a carbon price and a carbon price floor, and hopefully EU ETS will make it a carbon price floor that is pan-European. And indeed, it would be great to have a global carbon price floor so that you didn't get the carbon leakage issues we were talking about earlier. I hope that then incentivizes people to deal with their emissions in the most cost-effective way possible.
Hello, Jenny Holland from the Association for the Conservation of Energy. Particularly since this talk was focused around climate change mitigation, I was more than a little disappointed that we, in amongst all of these recitations of supply-side policies, we had only a glancing reference to energy efficiency. It's also the case that under this government we've seen an incredible dip in energy efficiency installations, and just last week we saw the lovely Department of Communities and Local Government down the road in another one of their retrograde steps proposed to remove display energy certificates, which have driven quite considerable energy efficiency improvements in the public sector. So I'd be interested to hear what you didn't say in your speech and how you might turn around some of those worrying trends in energy efficiency policy in the next Parliament if you get into government.
Well, it's funny because the amount of energy efficiency measures that have been put in place have been very significant. Clearly, action on energy efficiency is amongst the most currently amongst the most cost-effective ways of dealing with carbon emissions. And of course, it depends on the individual building what the individual approach should be. And I think it's very important to draw a distinction between what is subsidized and what happens. When energy prices are high, people are incentivized by their energy bills to undertake energy efficiency measures. The energy efficiency measures in new build are very clear. So there's been a huge amount of progress over the last 5 years on energy efficiency, and I've no doubt that will continue. But I think again it's very important to concentrate on the outcome that we're looking for, and have the most efficient and effective way of getting there, rather than to become ideological about any one particular policy of getting there. It's a bit like the question about which, what's your favorite technology? My favorite technology is the one that reduces carbon emissions the most, at the most reasonable cost. Energy efficiency at the moment actually plays a very important role in doing that. And that's the way that we should approach the question.
If I could just ask one question which leads on from that. There's a lot of talk at the moment about whether we should have a power sector decarbonisation target. So in the energy bill itself, that leaves the door open for that being done, put in place at some point in time. The language around that is all around grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, which sort of misses the point about energy efficiency. So I'm with you about the idea of technology neutrality, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I wonder whether, if that's the case, whether the power sector target that people are talking about is the right one, whether it's the right metric.
Well, the ultimate goal is that we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And there are lots and lots of different ways to do that. And we need to do that in the most cost-effective way possible. And many ways to do it, especially energy efficiency, reduces greenhouse gas emissions and reduces costs at the same time. So that hits the nail on the head in that sense. And intermediate targets can often discourage the most cost-effective way of reducing carbon. And one example is I was very pleased that in the 2030 European rules, there was not an individual country renewables target, because what I care about is reducing carbon emissions at the lowest possible cost.
Questions on this side?
Alistair Evans, Nuclear Industry Association. You mentioned in your speech, Matt, the need to attract investment for the UK. Do you think the ARMIT review is an effective way of doing that? And if not, what are the Conservative Party going to do to maintain it?
No, I think the ARMIT review missed the point. So we have an infrastructure plan. For the first time, the UK has written down the 700 or so infrastructure investment projects that are very important, and the government is working to deliver on them. But this needs to be a government project. It's an easy thing to say and a destructive thing to do, to say everything has to be independent of government. What independent means, essentially, is, in most cases, is unaccountable, and you need to get that accountability back in to anything that's made independent. Now, in the case of some of the biggest things, like statistics and the Bank of England, there are very strong accountability mechanisms to make sure that those things are rightly independent, but they are held accountable. Saying that things that are essentially based on planning concerns will be easier to do if they're independent, I think has been disproved by the attempt to do it in the last decade, because nobody ends up with an incentive to get anything through, and things become more complicated. My experience of government is you need ministers getting behind projects, making them happen, driving them through Whitehall, and to say it should all go to an independent area is just a way to, it's a cop-out, and it's a way to have something to say on a press release. Now, and a case in point is the Olympics, which is ironic given the involvement of some of the senior figures in the ARMIT report on the Olympics. The Olympics had ultimately reported to a ministerial board, and that was then, of course, there was operational freedom, as there is when you run any large project or organisation. But that's how things, in my experience, that's how things are best got done in government. The guy right at the back was shouting.
Marshall Hall, Oil and Gas UK. Do you see any tension or even incompatibility between progressive decarbonisation of the UK economy and maximising economic recovery of our own oil and gas resources?
A very good question, and the answer is absolutely not. And I wish I'd put that in my speech. It's very similar to the argument about whether we should unlock shale. There is a global market for oil and for gas, and for that matter for coal. And we as a nation are stronger by having a domestic production. We're stronger economically, we're stronger in terms of jobs, we're stronger in terms of our national security and security of supply. The question is about using energy, not about where the ultimate hydrocarbons come from. So I see no incompatibility whatsoever. And I'd say that if somebody else asked me, not just the guy from Oil and Gas UK.
Questions back from the guy?
Thanks. Guy Newey from OVO Energy, formerly of Policy Exchange. Very welcome focus on cost effectiveness and decarbonisation. Of course, one of the cheapest technologies for decarbonising is onshore wind. Why do you think so many Tories hate onshore wind?
Well, that's I think you put it quite strongly.
Quite accurately, I'd say.
The reason is that we have to tackle our international climate obligations, whilst also protecting our environment. And we live in a very beautiful country, and we need to make sure that that element of the environment is protected too. And it's entirely understandable that people want a say. I'm a very strong supporter of local decision-making over onshore wind and local planning. And to declare an interest, I've fought campaigns against wind farms in my constituency where they were proposed to be put up in Constable country, where 200 years ago they were painting paintings of the scenery. And it does the renewable industry and the cause for tackling climate change no good at all to ignore other environmental concerns, including the beauty of our landscape. And they have to be taken into account. Now, there will be places where local considerations are in favour of having onshore wind, and indeed, you can see other energy installations from the UK. But that absolutely has to be taken into account. And the system, before the changes we put in place, the system essentially had no local control over it at all. And I entirely understand why people got very upset. We need to make sure that we go green, but not at the expense of our green and pleasant land.
I'd just ask one question to follow up on that. What about where there are cases where a community has actually been in favour of a wind farm, but it's been called and rejected? How do we consolidate these things? How does that make sense?
Well, where there's a national consideration, that has to be taken into account as well. So I'm sure that that's what the DCLG will have done.
Question in the front there?
Jeremy Mayhew, not wearing any particular hat. I wanted to just come back to the question of possible divisions between Liberal Democrats and Conservatives, to be helpful. It seemed to me that to deploy the language that Nigel Lawson uses in his book on climate change, where he draws the division between those who are in favour of mitigation, foregoing growth, versus adaptation, which he argues mankind has always been brilliant at doing. Most Conservatives are on the side of emphasising adaptation, while you'd find quite a lot of Liberal Democrats who were in favour of mitigation.
Well, these are questions of degree, and also questions of the risk. It is about managing very significant but hard to measure risks. I think so. That's my answer to the balance. As it happens, I think we're coming to a point where, because of the development of renewables and the fall in cost, the compromise and the tension between the two may be lessened, and that'll be a very exciting moment.
I'm just conscious of the time. I think we'll have a couple more questions and then close. So there are 2 questions at the back.
Jennifer Webber, Renewable UK. I just wanted to come back on the onshore wind point briefly. You mentioned that you had a strong concern with local people making decisions, but that you were also committed to cost reduction. So does that mean that it's your personal view that if onshore wind is able to get local consents and compete with other low carbon forms in auction, that it should be able to continue?
I think that there will be, firstly, we're very clear that there will not be subsidised onshore wind in a Conservative government. When it comes to, but then we've moved the planning system to give much more local say. So I think that manages to square the circle and gives you a very clear answer in terms of how, at what point you think that subsidy makes onshore wind worthwhile.
One final question. There was a hand up right at the back.
Hi, Vicky O'Brien from the Recruitment and Employment Confederation. Building on that last question, you mentioned in your speech about the importance of human ingenuity to making this all happen. And I was wondering whether you could elaborate on what the government is planning to do in terms of ensuring that local jobs markets benefit and indeed developing the local talent pipelines that are in place, because my organisation has a couple of hundred recruiters in membership who are reporting a shrinking candidate pool, an ageing workforce, and also unsustainable wage inflation, and then not exactly a diverse workforce as well. So, yeah, if you could elaborate on that.
Okay, it's a very good question, and as it happens throughout this Parliament, it's only very recently I've been having people start to complain about unsustainable wage inflation. The political debate has been elsewhere. But the skills point is very important, and especially as unemployment falls, making sure that there are enough people with the skills to deliver is vital. So we're putting in place a series of national colleges and the training frameworks needed, and the apprenticeships that go with them. But also it's not just about the sort of national skills infrastructure solutions. It's also about making sure that when we have projects, they have a supply chain plan that ensures that the supply chain can be in place. We've now got that with the offshore wind propositions. On nuclear, we're working incredibly hard. One of the advantages of the fact it takes a long time to build a nuclear power station is that that gives us the time to train up local people to do the building. And I was at Hinckley on Monday, actually, opening a skills centre to make sure that so they can train the apprentices now in anticipation of the building happening in a couple of years' time. So it's a really important issue. We've got a whole series of programmes in place to try to solve it, but it's no doubt one that we'll keep having to work at, especially as the economy continues to strengthen and unemployment comes down.
So I think we'll close there. If we'd all just like to put your hands together and thank the Minister.